In May 1945, Winston Churchill stood at the pinnacle of his career.
The man who had led Britain through its darkest hour was now celebrated around the world.
Yet within weeks, he would be fighting for his political life.
And discovering that winning an election was not the same thing as winning a war.
This is part one of our series on Churchill and the 1945 general election, Gestapo.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me, as ever, is Professor Richard Toye, the Francis Fukuyama to my Rufus T. Firefly.
Wow. So we're going to be talking about one of the most celebrated political defeats in British political history, Churchill's defeat at the 1945 general election. Now, just weeks earlier on VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, in May 1945, Churchill had stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health in London, leading in the crowds in this slightly tuneless rendition of Rule Britannia. He was at the height of his global prestige at this point, yet within a few weeks he was going to be pilloried for allegedly stepping down from the pedestal of national leadership into the sordid arena of party politics.
I just want to congratulate you on the use of the word sordid there, which I think is a Churchill call-out.
Yeah, he did like that word, didn't he?
Yeah, he used it a lot.
So let's step back a bit to put this in context. Why was an election taking place at this particular moment? And indeed, what was the balance of forces, the political situation that had arisen over the previous 5 years since Churchill had become Prime Minister in May 1940?
Well, and I think I also need to take a moment for my American compatriots. This is one of those things that shocks American. How could Winston Churchill lose an election at the apex of his power in 1945? Well, and one of the things we have to remember is the British system is a party system. You elect a party, not a specific person or prime minister. It's voting for either the Conservative, Labour, or Liberal party, not a specific person. And so I think that's an important contextual thing for my side of the pond to understand going into this. But I agree with you entirely, Richard. It's also super important to understand the political context going into this, which has deep roots in the 30s, but things that also occurred during the 40s as well, and the rise and legitimization, really, of the Labour Party movement.
Well, that's right. And I think most people would agree that the defeat of Churchill and the large-scale Labour victory in 1945 wasn't just the product of a few weeks of a campaign. It was something which had its roots at least as far back as May 1940, arguably earlier, but May 1940 was critical. This was the point at which, of course, Churchill becomes Prime Minister as part of a coalition. And so that is his unique selling point, or one of his, not his only selling point, I suppose, but a key selling point for why he can be Prime Minister and why sort of Neville Chamberlain no longer can, is that the Labour Party and also the Liberals are willing to come in and serve as ministers under Churchill. They might have been willing to do so under Lord Halifax as well. That wasn't quite put to the test, but it was this capacity for bringing about cross-party unity at a moment of national crisis, which allowed or helped Churchill to actually become Prime Minister. And at the same time, of course, this was something which started to lend the Labour Party itself credibility because its participation in the government was also seen as essential. And we've talked in previous episodes about the important role, much of it hidden from the public, of course, that Clement Attlee, Labour Party leader, and Arthur Greenwood, deputy Labour leader, had played in the crisis of late May 1940, these debates over whether or not Britain should explore peace terms and so on. And perhaps more publicly, because Attlee was not a particularly charismatic person, the sort of the most visible face of the Labour Party during the war was Ernest Bevin, Minister of Labour, former trade union leader and very big personality. And so these men were, from serving in the government, were not only developing their own credibility, but were showing the essential nature of having the Labour Party in the government, which could only strengthen their position when a general election was called, because previous Labour governments had only been minorities, they'd been very short, and the last one in 1931 had ended in a financial crisis and a big disaster.
Well, that's right. And I really think the fact that this moment of crisis created a situation in which Labor could enter the conversation as, I'm going to say, an adult player, a party that could be trusted, because I think traditionally speaking, in terms of the political view of the Labor Party in the 1930s, particularly after things had ended the way they did under the MacDonald government,
Yeah,
there was this
Ramsay
view.
MacDonald, who was the first Labour Prime Minister and had ended up, when that Labour government fell in 1931, basically allying himself with the Conservatives and parts of the Liberal Party, so seen as a traitor
Like
by Labour figures.
Oh, no, well, that's absolutely right. And so the leadership of Labor was in disarray, which allowed, I think, a view of Labor as a social movement to be put off as something that's viewed as radical, something that's very akin to Bolshevism, very fringe. But basically, by them coming into the government, there was a move to legitimize them as actually, these are just British, this is a British political party. This is normal. They're normal. And I think people started to see that the government was run well by the Labor Party. I mean, I think it's no secret to say a lot of the day-to-day governmental stuff was more or less handled by Attlee and Bevan and others on
Right.
the Labor side, not the Conservative side necessarily.
Right, right. I mean, I suppose one would say that the honours were shared a bit, but the other thing which is worth mentioning is that, of course, the Conservative Party, not Churchill personally, who to a degree stood above, it was seen to stand above party, but the Conservative Party had been discredited by appeasement during the 1930s, and the Labour Party had been out of office, of course, and therefore they weren't going to get the blame for things like the Munich Agreement. Some scholars have said that the ghost of Neville Chamberlain was still hanging around the Conservative Party in 1945. But to go back to what you were saying about the day-to-day running of the government, there's a good quote from Ellen Wilkinson, who became a junior minister, was a famous and quite fiery left-wing figure who Churchill saw as the most left-wing figure in his government, I think. And she says that when Churchill was running a cabinet meeting, everybody, had this sense of having been present on a sort of a great historic occasion, but he didn't really actually get through the agenda of what was being decided. Whereas when Attlee was in charge, running cabinet meetings, when Churchill often obviously was away during the war at summits and so forth, it wasn't very dramatic, but you got through the business.
Yeah, and I love that quote, because you can imagine Churchill bloviating and making all sorts of pronunciations and really holding court.
Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine that, right? I mean, that's super easy. Whereas if you can think of Attlee running a meeting, he's a very advanced level bureaucrat who was just like, let's get through the agenda.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a very good point, because, of course, the various diarists who are present, they'll often record in quite great length what Churchill said, and they're often complaining about the fact that he won't sort of stick to the agenda. I think it definitely gets worse as the war goes on and he's getting more tired. This wasn't necessarily a big issue in 1940 itself, but by 1944, 1945, and people are just getting fed up with it. But there's writing down all the stuff that he says, whereas Attlee has got this famous, very clipped style, which is basically you have a cabinet paper, you say, are there any objections? You don't really give them very much chance to raise any objections, and then you say, right, no objections, move on to the next business.
Right. I mean, which is exactly what you want if you've ever sat in a committee meeting. You want somebody who can just get you through so you can go about your day.
Yeah.
You don't want someone holding court. And so I think through this very sophisticated and efficient method of governance at the cabinet level, you see a shift occur among the way people thought about government, in that Labor suddenly was responsible, they were coherent, they were good administrators. And so it led to this idea of socialism was the highest level of natural patriotism. We're a community and we're in this together. And that really becomes an obvious theme of how labor ran the government during these crises.
That's right. So, in a sense, they don't allow the Conservatives to monopolise the patriotic card, which, again, as I was saying earlier, has been undermined rather by the perceived failures of appeasement and Munich and so on. And so I think it also helps that Attlee as a person, he's very middle class, so that he's quite safe, as you will, from the point of view of media presentation. He's not a rough, horny-handed son of toil. He's not going to scare the horses. But also they do have, it should be said, that Bevin, for example, Ernest Bevin, not to be confused with Anirban Bevin, who was Minister of Health in 1945, but wasn't in the coalition government and was a critic from outside. But there was a very solid, large number of genuinely working class people in the Labour Party, in a way in which subsequent decades that element tended to get seriously whittled down in favour of more middle class presentation. But I think there was a strength in the Labour Party that it had the middle class friendly Attlee plus the people who would genuinely come up from the working classes.
And I think you can see this. So correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Attlee smoke a pipe?
Yes, I mean, I think probably everybody was smoking something, weren't they?
No, they were. But this is really important, because if you think about Churchill and his cigars and how he is caricatured, cigar is a very patrician thing. It comes from Cuba. There's a lot of industry that goes into presenting these very magical cigars. And I think, as in the imagination of the people, a cigar is a very aristocratic thing to smoke. I think that's still probably true. Whereas a pipe is what everybody smoked. I mean, that was a working man's or a middle class thing to smoke. And the fact that Attlee represented these middle class values, which were more like, hey, we're in this together as a community, really lent itself as juxtapositions to Churchill's cigar. That's just a little thought from the cartoon world where I live.
And so basically by 1942, and this comes just after the victory at El Alamein, there is a bombshell onto the domestic political scene, which is a report on the social and allied services, not very glamorous title, by a man called Sir William Beveridge, who was a former director of the London School of Economics and was a civil servant. And basically he'd been given what was expected to be a totally dry job of making some proposals for reform of social services. And he does it in a very dramatic way. He talks about the 5 giants of want and disease, et cetera, that have to be slain. And these proposals send a thrill not only through the labour movement, through the country more broadly, as kind of hopes for a better future, exactly at the moment where the tide has started to turn in the war. And this actually presents Churchill with a really big problem about how to react, because this is very popular. People start rushing out and buying this white paper, boring government policy document, which people wouldn't normally go out and shop for or want to read. And I think that Churchill struggles with this because he wants to concentrate on winning the war and really doesn't know how to react.
I mean, there's a contrast, right, between Churchill, the war leader, and Churchill, the party leader of the Conservatives. Churchill, the war leader, wants to focus on the war, and Churchill, the conservative, doesn't want to see the government wrapped up in this idea that the government's actually putting out very labor-friendly policies that are exciting the masses, but not the conservatives, right? And so this has put him in a real political tight spot.
That's right. And so he does react kind of somewhat belatedly. There are huge ructions in the government. There's a rebellion by Labour MPs who want the Beveridge Report implemented immediately. And so Churchill reacts in March 1943 with a so-called 4 years plan, national broadcast, listened to by an extraordinary 73.8% of the potential audience, which is like the second highest figure for one of his speeches during the war. And you'd think most people would say, well, what was listened to most? It would have been all the ones in 1940, right? Rather than this one, which basically everybody's now forgotten about, except for the listeners to our podcasts and us. And so he talks up social reform. He does, of course, have a pre-World War I record of support for social reform. He says there is no finer investment than putting milk into babies. It goes down quite well with some parts of the population. Yet I think that Churchill, having made this nod in the direction of reacting to pressure for social reform, then leaves things really for over another 2 years until he mentions it again. So it's like, okay, I've done that. Now let me go back to fighting the war. And so after the break, why don't we talk about how that coalition government broke up and then how that played into the early stages of the election campaign? Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, where I'm talking about the 1945 general election with the Bevin to my Attlee, Dr. Warren Dockter, and we're talking about the sort of the breakup of Churchill's coalition government in May 1945. And left-wing MPs and activists within the Labour Party have for some time been increasingly discontented with the direction of the government, which they don't see that there's being enough done in the direction of planning for the post-war world, implementing new social policies. And so they're really quite keen to get out of this. And eventually, once the war in Europe ends, Churchill gives Labour the choice of staying in the coalition until the defeat of Japan or having an immediate election.
Right. Well, and is it ultimately, it was the Labor Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, who was the one that convinced the executive of the Labor Party to withdraw immediately.
Yeah, and so I think that Churchill thought that he was offering Labour a dilemma, sort of either lock them in or sort of get rid of them immediately. And of course, this is all stuff which gets argued about during the campaign. It's the election campaign itself, like who was really responsible for breaking up the coalition. No, it was you. Here are some, publish some letters,
Yeah.
etc., etc. So it all gets a bit nasty. But basically, I think that Morrison and those who backed him really make the right call, because by this point, there's an appetite for change in the country and they seize the moment. And it's just worth saying, again, this needs clarifying not only for American listeners or people outside Britain, but I think people inside Britain as well, that the coalition breaks up. But Churchill continues as prime minister. He creates a new so-called caretaker government, which is going to run the country until the election actually takes place. And so he's trying to bring in people like Gwilym Lloyd George, the son of David Lloyd George, who's a liberal, and other figures like sort of the Earl of Rosebery, who's the son of a former Liberal Prime Minister, to try and say this isn't just a Conservative government, because he knows the Conservatives are a bit toxic. He's trying to, again, use the national label. And so it's very striking that if you go online and search for Conservative Party Manifesto 1945, what you will actually find is a document which is called Mr. Churchill's Declaration of Policy to the Electors, right? It doesn't say the Conservative Party Manifesto. It deliberately does not include the word conservative in the entire manifesto. And so he's really going heavily on his own personal brand here as a way of dealing with this toxicity of the Tory party.
Well, yeah, and I think it's not for nothing, but I think it's worth pointing out here that Churchill had spent a large part of the 1930s saying, hey, I'm a part of the Conservative Party, but I'm not really like those guys. And so he's already, because he even realizes, particularly by Chamberlain's government and as things evolved at the end of the 30s, that being a conservative was quite toxic among the British masses.
I'm just going to jump in here and say that, of course, when he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he didn't become leader of the Conservative Party immediately. Neville Chamberlain was still leader of the Conservative Party. He resigned through ill health later in the year. And there were those, I think maybe including Clementine Churchill, who said, don't become leader of the Conservative Party. You should be above all this.
Yeah.
And I think his justifiable calculation at that point is like, I need the levers of power here. I don't want some other guy who is commanding the loyalty of Conservative MPs and has got the power to chuck me out, right?
Yeah.
that moment, that's a logical decision. But this comes back to bite him, really, in 1945.
Right. And particularly when he forms that caretaker government, because as you were saying, he tries to bring in what he described as national figures from different parties, particularly the Liberal Party, which, of course, he himself had been a member of years ago.
Yeah.
But effectively, it was a conservative government.
Right, right. But he does talk a lot about, he even says at one stage, I am a liberal as much as a Tory. So he's trying to play on that dual identity. And remember that William Beveridge, who we mentioned earlier, who wrote this famous report, was a liberal. And
Yep.
in the aftermath of publishing the report, becomes a liberal MP. So there's this assumption that because Beveridge is popular and is a liberal, that liberalism also is very popular. And I think that Churchill is sort of partly trying to play up to that, but also trying to say, if you're a liberal voter, I'm a legitimate person for you to vote for. You don't have to say, I'm switching to the Tories. You can say, well, I'm voting for that famous, well-known liberal Winston Churchill.
Right. Yeah. Which is actually, I think, in light of everything, not a bad move. It's actually quite politically astute. But as we'll see, that strategy is not necessarily the winning strategy. But what is also interesting, I think, about this election that we're barreling towards in 1945 is it becomes a beginning point for standard British programmatic politics. The use of manifestos, the use of ideology, the way the party electorate works is defined, particularly for the latter half of the 20th century, in this election.
Absolutely. And also, what we call the two-party system really reaches its height between 1945 and 1951. Actually, people talk now about the breakdown of the British two-party system. I'm like, well, it didn't really ever exist, except maybe for about 15 years. And everybody thought that was normal, that we should have two parties. Actually, it's been considerably more diverse. But I think that what Labour do, remember we're talking about some of the weaknesses in Churchill's position, but there are also strengths in Labour's position. They have this famous manifesto called Let Us Face the Future. It promises a National Health Service, which is now seen as the greatest achievement of the Labour government. Actually, Churchill's document says more about the National Health Service than the Labour one does in terms of number of words. Neither of these documents is. They're both still pretty short. Actually, they're not big, massive things of the very, very hefty, almost book-like productions you sometimes get today. But it was essentially, it's got this iconic V, V for victory, but standing. So again, as you were saying earlier, this using the patriotic motif, and I think what's really important is that Churchill's position in this election is the war is still going on, right? We've talked about VE Day, victory in Europe. Well, there's a war with Japan, right? And like, hey, I, Winston Churchill, I'm a great war leader, so there's a war, so I'll be good, right? The problem that he's got is that Japan, Far East, very long way away, and people would rather prefer to think the war had finished. And remember, of course, that the war was expected to maybe last another 2 years. People didn't know about the atomic bomb, obviously. And so Churchill's perfectly reasonable argument is, hey, another 2 years of war, keep me in charge. But people's minds have basically moved elsewhere.
Right. But I mean, it's interesting that in the political engineering, the politicking of the day, right? Churchill and the really whole conservative parties relying on that character. We've gone this far together. Let's keep going on. We don't know how much longer the war is going to go. And so I think it's interesting that they're mailing out their material with a picture of Churchill on it. And again, not really like for conservatives or, hey, we're conservatives. It's like, hey, Churchill. That's the whole brand that they're putting it on. But of course, that brings us to a seminal moment in this political campaign, which is a great rhetorical crisis.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. And this is 4th of June, 1945, the first broadcast of the campaign, a radio broadcast. Of course, there was no TV during the war. Should mention there were cinema newsreels, and Churchill and Attlee both do one of those, reached about 20 million people, apparently, each of those. But the sort of radio broadcast, probably more important, certainly far more famous. And this is the bombshell. This is why we have this title for our episode, that partway through the speech, Churchill says no socialist government could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance.
That's rather throwing the cat amongst the pigeons by saying, hey, we've just fought a war against Nazis, maybe the worst people ever produced in history. And the guys that we're now running with that helped us beat them, they're like them. It's nuts. I mean, this is nuts. And one
Yeah.
of my favorite things about this is the people closest to Churchill that knew he was going to do this, Clementine's a great example, begged him to delete this odious and in reference to the Gestapo. John Colville, his loyalist lieutenant, is like, this wasn't his greatest work. I mean, it's really remarkable. Even the people close to him knew that this was a ludicrous maneuver.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to let me be devil's advocate here for a little bit.
Oh, I like that.
What I'm going to say is that, of course, it didn't work. There's no real argument that it was very effective, except that actually we haven't talked about opinion polls. Opinion polls had put Labour very strongly ahead from March 1943 onwards. There hadn't really been any opinion polls before that. Polls were not as scientific then as they are now, although people, of course, still get things wrong. But in fact, the gap between, although Labour always stayed ahead, the gap between Labour and the Conservatives narrowed during the campaign. And so did opinion really shift? We don't know. But it's fair to say that whatever Churchill did during the campaign, it didn't actually make the situation any worse and conceivably actually improved the Conservatives' situation. So that's my maybe this wasn't as disastrous as everybody says argument.
Well, I don't know, Richard, because you're relying on unscientific opinion polls, not like the opinion polls that say Gallup today. By the way, Gallup, if you'd like to sponsor us, your polls are great all the time. But I'm just saying there, and maybe it's apocryphal, right? That this speech is because I've read cases that say that it was neck and neck, and then Churchill gave this speech, and that blew up the whole thing, which is obviously not the case. But at the same time, him imbuing the idea or intentionally muddying the waters between the concept of labor-fueled socialism with totalitarianism is quite a cynical move, I think.
I'm going to say that it's sort of not something I agree with. I'm not going to say that is. I'm going to say it's a defensible philosophical political position associated, of course, with the work of Hayek and his book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, where people have been trying to get Hayek's ideas into Churchill's hands. How much influence, direct influence, is we're not quite sure. But what Churchill was trying to do, and might have worked if he'd been more subtle about it. So what he was trying to do was to say, okay, you start off by nationalising the mines, which is one of the key proposals of the Labour Party. And then you end up in a situation whereas that's not really getting you the control of the economy that you want, and therefore you need to nationalise more things, take more economic control. And he would argue that because this socialist economics doesn't work, then you end up not only having to take away market freedoms, economic freedoms, you end up having to repress political freedom and freedom of expression. Now, he's trying to pack all that into this phrase, which then suggests that, as you mentioned, the people who had been inside the war cabinet with him, like Clement Attlee, were in fact going to act in a Nazi-like way. And so it's very clumsy. I mean, I'd certainly 100% agree that. But 5 years later, he does this similar type argument in an election broadcast, tones it down,
right,
and gets away with it. And I mean, he should have listened to Clementine, who said, take that bit out. Well, it certainly wouldn't have been so attention-seeking.
Right. Sorry, I mean, I absolutely agree with. You can absolutely trace the intellectual origins of this concept to Hayek, but I think the way he framed it, it's cynical. And I think it was made in such a brutal fashion out of desperation because he had seen those opinion polls and thought, we're way behind. I got to do something. So I'm swinging for the fences.
He hadn't seen the opinion polls.
Oh, he hadn't? I thought he had. Okay.
No.
Well, that invalidates me as a human.
Like he kind of like next year, I think Lord Moran, his doctor, tells him about them, but he goes, "What? I didn't know about that." It's interesting to think about what would have happened if he had known about the opinion polls and had taken them seriously. I think he would have actually been a bit dismissive of this. He'd have been, well, hell, I know the electorate, and makes this big election tour seen by thousands of, or maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are cheering him. He is personally popular. And
No, of course. And
yeah,
one of my favorite points about this is and I know you've seen it. The posters for the Labor Party have a picture of Churchill on them that say "Cheer for Churchill, vote for Labor." I mean, that's a remarkable campaign slogan.
right. And so and in effect, that is what happens in the election in the end. But finally, let's point out one thing about why does he say Gestapo? Well, what he really wanted to say, he wanted to refer to the Soviet NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB. But of course, at this time, the Soviet Union was still wartime ally of Britain and the United States, so he couldn't start slagging them off, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think what we're seeing is that Churchill is caught in a position where he's got lots of moves that he can make that in some way seem logical, focus very heavily on my own personal brand, appeal to liberals, pretend that I'm not really anything to do with the Conservative Party, and then go in hard attacking the Labour Party with the really nastiest slogan that I can come up with. And yet none of these things actually work. I think that the problem he's got to an extent is when you're explaining, you're not winning, and he's doing a lot of explaining.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly it. So, for instance, his overreach, his rhetorical overreach, opens him up. I mean, you think of a boxing match; he's opened himself up to anything Attlee wants to do to him at that point. And of course,
this is exactly right. So tell us what he says the following night.
so Attlee also is aware of Hayek's influence on this. And he basically dismisses the broadcast as, quote, a secondhand version of the academic views of an Austrian professor. And it's just like,
Yeah, that's like how terrible to very suspicious, very a professor and Austrian at the same time.
exactly. I don't know about you, but Austrians have been getting us into a lot of trouble. So it's a very classy way to be like, look at this guy. But I mean, I think it's also very emblematic of how he danced in the ring, as it were. I don't know why I keep returning to boxing metaphors, but I do. So let's just go with it.
So basically what he says is that he sarcastically thanks Churchill for disillusioning those who might have been tempted to vote for Churchill out of wartime gratitude. And he says, so the voice we heard last night was that of Mr. Churchill, but the mind was that of Lord Beaverbrook. So remember, Lord Beaverbrook, of course, is the key Churchill pal, owner of the Daily Express, Evening Standard, and somebody who is seen as an evil genius advisor to Churchill. There's no evidence, actually, that Beaverbrook had any direct impact to the speech whatsoever, but this is guilt by association, and it works.
No, it does, because it brilliantly echoes Labour's campaign. It's like, well, Churchill himself couldn't have done something so ridiculous. It must have been that nasty Lord Beaverbrook.
Yeah, exactly. So the good note to close on is that the way in which Labour deal with the fact that they've got an extremely personally popular opponent is to separate two things. But there are two Churchills. There is the great national leader who we all ought to respect, and then there is the dirty playing party politician who has come down off that national pedestal, and you certainly shouldn't consider voting for if you know what's good for you. Churchill thought he was warning voters about the dangers of socialism.
Instead, many heard an attack on colleagues who had helped win the war.
The campaign was only just beginning.
But already the greatest political asset in Britain risked becoming a political liability.
Next time, we'll follow the rest of the campaign to polling day and beyond.
And ask how Winston Churchill, at the height of his fame, suffered one of the most remarkable electoral defeats in British history.
And if you'd like to continue the discussion,
join our LinkedIn group and stay in touch with the podcast community.
And in the meantime, KBO.